25 years later, pastor's son uncovers bag under tree. Hidden ledger exposes church leader's dark secret. There are phone calls that wake you up, and there are phone calls that wake your soul. It was just after 5 o'clock a.m. when David Carter's phone rang, sharp and cold, like a knock at the back of his skull. The kind of call that doesn't come from a friend or a bill collector. It comes from the past, a past you tried to bury, one you hoped would rot away quietly beneath your years of silence. David sat up, heart already pounding before his hand reached the receiver. The room was still half dark, a grainy blue from the weak Ozark morning light. His apartment smelled faintly of old books and microwave dinners, two things that hadn't changed in decades. He hesitated, then picked up. "Mr. Carter, this is Detective Sarah Dawson with the Arkansas State Police. I'm calling regarding a recent discovery in the Markham County Forest. It may be connected to your father's case." The words hit like cold water. Every syllable scraped against a scar that never healed right. For a moment, David forgot how to breathe. "My father's case?" he repeated, the taste of old grief climbing up the back of his throat. "That was 25 years ago. You're sure this isn't some kind of sick joke?" "I understand your skepticism, sir," the voice replied evenly, but a logger found something buried under a tree stump, an old sports bag. Inside was a pastoral robe, a Bible, with your father's name inscribed inside. Silence. Not disbelief, not denial. Just silence. Thick, stretching, aching. David didn't answer immediately. He looked across the room at the TV still playing from the night before. Some late-night sermon rerun, a preacher's voice echoing through the static. Hymns playing faintly under stained glass visuals. It had been years since David let himself listen to anything holy without flinching. He finally spoke. "I'll be ready. Just give me a minute." When the line went dead, he sat motionless for a beat longer, like a man waiting for his body to catch up with the weight of his soul. Then he stood, slowly, as if the ground under him had shifted. He dressed without thinking. Jeans, a navy shirt, boots that still had the dust of last month's hikes. His hands moved on autopilot, but his chest felt like a drum stretched too tight. He stopped at the bookshelf by the front door. On the top shelf sat a photo. His father, Reverend Isaiah Carter, standing behind a wooden pulpit, face lit with conviction, hand mid-gesture, mid-sermon. There was clarity in his eyes, and love, and something David had long since lost, faith. 25 years. 25 silent, aching years since that face vanished from their home, from the church, from this world. No note, no goodbye, just gone. And now, a bag, a Bible, a name. The knock came just as he laced his boots. 2 officers waited outside. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded. David stepped into the morning, into the car, into a silence thicker than fog. The ride to the forest was mostly quiet. The officer in the driver's seat tried once to make conversation, but stopped when David didn't answer. It wasn't rudeness. It was something else. Grief circling the drain, too loud to speak over. 15 minutes out of town, the road turned to gravel. Pines grew taller and tighter, the world shrinking into green shadows and morning mist. Finally, they stopped at a clearing now lined with yellow police tape and a handful of uniforms. There were cameras, notepads, evidence bags, and then there was the tree stump, a wide, rotted base, ringed with age and hollowed by time. At its center, the earth had been disturbed, a hole, a cavity in the past. David's boots sank slightly in the softened ground as he walked closer. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes approached and offered her hand. "Detective Sarah Dawson, thank you for coming." David nodded, eyes fixed on the tarp beside the stump where the bag sat. It looked so ordinary. Faded blue, a brand logo half peeled from weather and age. "Tom Jenkins," a voice said behind him. A logger with rough hands and tired eyes stepped forward. "I found it. We were clearing dead stumps. This one felt off. When I dug, I found the bag. Called it in right away." David crouched down, staring at the bag. The moment his eyes landed on the initials stitched faintly on the edge, "I.C.," his throat tightened. Detective Dawson gestured for the techs to open it. They did, carefully, as if the dead might still be listening. The robe came first, folded, slightly damp, aged but intact. Then the Bible, leather-worn, pages fused together by time and moisture. One officer gently peeled it open, and there, on the inner cover, scrawled in the deep, familiar script that had once taught David how to write his own name: Reverend Isaiah Carter. He couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. It was like someone had reached back through time and gripped his chest. Then came the note, tucked between pages near the back. Damp, but legible. "Why do the wicked thrive? Why must suffering silence the righteous? Deliver me from those who twist the word to chain the innocent. My heart is not afraid of death, but afraid of silence." David staggered back a step. This wasn't the man who would walk away from his faith. This wasn't a coward's goodbye. This was a cry, a final prayer that no one had heard until now. Detective Dawson touched his arm gently. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, eyes wet, but jaw set. "No," he said, "but I'm ready." As the police began processing the scene, collecting every fiber and thread, David walked back toward the edge of the clearing. The morning sun had risen higher now, piercing through the trees. He turned his face upward. Let the light hit him for the first time in a long while. But inside, a storm had started. There was no peace in this. Not yet. Only questions. Who buried the bag? Who wanted it hidden? Who feared the truth enough to leave a man's name to rot under tree roots? And above all, why now? That question echoed as David looked back one last time at the gaping hole under the old stump. Because whatever answers waited, they were buried deeper than he ever imagined. The ride home felt longer than the trip out. David sat in the back of the police vehicle, watching the trees thin into roads, the roads into neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods into the kind of silence that only grief truly understands. The officer driving didn't speak. He didn't have to. David's face said everything. When they dropped him off, he nodded in thanks, though the gesture felt distant, automatic. His feet touched the ground, but his soul hadn't caught up. The sun had risen fully now, and the warmth on his skin only reminded him how long it had been since the world last felt warm. Inside his apartment, the door clicked shut with a hollowness that hurt more than usual. He didn't turn the lights on. He walked straight to the bookshelf in the spare room, the one he had carefully turned into a replica of his father's old study. Isaiah Carter had always been organized. Sermon notes stacked by date, devotionals lined neatly in order, years and years of theology handwritten in long, thoughtful strokes. David ran his fingers along the leather bindings. Dust scattered in little bursts of gold in the morning light. Then, a gap. There was no 1977. His heart stuttered. No diary, no Sunday sermon notebook, just an empty space, like a missing tooth in the mouth of truth. David knelt and opened the bottom cabinet. Inside were Isaiah's personal Bibles, childhood photos, funeral programs of old congregants. He pulled out every notebook, every envelope. Nothing from 1977. It didn't make sense. His father had recorded everything. He once wrote that missing a sermon record was like forgetting to breathe. He didn't misplace things. He didn't skip entries. He didn't just disappear from his own words, unless someone made sure those words disappeared. David leaned back against the wall, the weight of 25 years pressing down on his chest again. But this time, it wasn't just grief. It was suspicion. Something about that bag in the woods. Something about the way it had been buried, intentionally, deliberately. Not hidden by time, but by someone's hands. Someone had made a decision. Isaiah Carter's voice did not deserve to be heard after 1976. David stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the Ozark foothills stretched quietly, innocent as ever. But they had held a secret for a long time. He knew where he had to go next. The Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church hadn't changed much in 25 years. The bricks had darkened a little. The roof seemed weather-worn, but the silhouette was the same. The steeple still reached for heaven like it was trying to prove something, and the stained glass still caught the light in a way that made David's heart ache. He parked across the street, palms sweating on the steering wheel. He hadn't stepped inside a church since his father disappeared. Not because he stopped believing, but because it hurt too much to pretend he still did. He crossed the street slowly, each step crunching on gravel, like memory itself was resisting. The heavy wooden doors groaned as he pushed them open, and just like that, he was inside the last place his father had ever truly lived. The sanctuary smelled of lemon oil and old hymnals. Pews lined with velvet, windows casting kaleidoscopes across the floor. At the altar stood a man, adjusting a microphone. David cleared his throat. The man turned. He was older, grayer, but unmistakable. "Pastor Brooks?" David asked. The man's eyes widened. "Yes. Can I help you?" "I'm David Carter, son of Reverend Isaiah Carter." For a moment, it looked like the pastor had seen a ghost, then his features softened into something almost fatherly. "My lord, David, I haven't seen you since you were a boy. Good heavens, I thought you'd... Well, I didn't expect you here." "Neither did I," David said quietly. Pastor Walter Green appeared next, walking from a side hallway, carrying a stack of church programs. He froze when he saw David. "Look who's here," Pastor Brooks said, trying to sound warm, but his voice had a brittle edge. David explained why he'd come: the bag in the forest, the Bible, the note, the missing 1977 sermon books. And finally, he asked the question that had been burning in his chest since the moment he saw that empty space on his bookshelf. Do either of you remember seeing my father's notes from that year? His diary? His sermons? They exchanged glances. No, Pastor Green said first. If we had, I promise we would have turned them in long ago. Your father kept many of his writings private, as you know. But surely something from that year should have been here, David pressed. He didn't miss a single Sunday. It doesn't add up. I'm sorry, David, Brooks replied. We truly don't know. The air hung heavy between them. David nodded slowly, though the knot in his stomach told him the conversation hadn't ended. It had just begun. I appreciate your time, he said, and turned to leave. He didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he walked around the back of the church to the small cemetery where his mother had been laid to rest. It had been years since he stood at her grave. He stopped at the familiar headstone: Sarah Carter, beloved wife and mother. A few steps away, under the shade of an oak tree, sat a boy, small, alone, head pressed to his knees. He was crying. David approached slowly. Hey, kid, he said gently. You all right? The boy looked up, startled. His face was red, eyes glassy. I'm not supposed to talk to strangers. That's fair, David said, but you're sitting by yourself in a cemetery, and it's a hot day. You look like you have a fever. I don't want to go home, the boy whispered. Why not? My aunt and uncle. They don't want me. They only keep me because the state gives them money. I heard them say it. David's chest tightened. The pain was too familiar. I used to live with relatives too, he said. After my mom passed, after my dad disappeared, it wasn't easy. The boy wiped his nose. What happened to your dad? David looked at the gravestone, then back at the boy. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The boy reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a communion card. When I was sick, my mom used to ask the church for the holy bread and juice. She said it would make me feel better. David smiled, surprised by the sudden warmth that filled his chest. You mean the take-home communion? The boy nodded. I remember that, David said softly. I used to help my dad prepare it for the sick. He said God's love can travel, even in small packages. The boy sniffled. Can you get one for me? David hesitated. You need a doctor first. The boy nodded reluctantly. But you'll bring it? I will, David promised. You have my word. He took the boy by the hand, helped him up, and together they walked to the car. As they drove toward the hospital, the boy leaned against the window, silent, feverish. David glanced at him, then back at the road. He was too focused to notice what he had left behind. Back at the church library, on a table beneath the stained glass light, sat a book he had brought with him, a sermon notebook from a different year, left behind, forgotten in his search. Still resting there quietly, waiting to be found again. You just don't know sometimes when a missing piece is about to find its way home. David didn't return home after leaving the hospital. The boy, Noah, had fallen asleep quickly once the fever medication began working. Nurses promised to keep him hydrated and monitor his temperature. David had stayed just long enough to sign the admission paperwork and reassure Noah's reluctant guardians that he would follow up with the communion he'd promised. But as he stepped back into the evening light, something inside him refused to let go. His car engine idled beneath him as the hospital fell behind. The steering wheel didn't guide him home. It turned on instinct, on memory, on the echo of something unspoken. The road led him straight back to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. The parking lot was mostly empty now. Golden hour light stretched long shadows across the bricks. David stepped out of the car slowly, feeling the weight of the promise he'd made to the boy, pressing alongside the ghosts still lingering inside this building. When he entered, the sanctuary was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest rather than calmed it. A young staff member stood near the back, organizing pamphlets. He didn't recognize David. "Can I help you, sir?" the young man asked, polite but guarded. "I'm looking for Pastor Brooks or Reverend Green. Are they around?" The young man shook his head. "They're out at the church cemetery right now. Said they're performing some sort of blessing." David blinked. "A blessing? At this hour?" The staff member shrugged. "They do that sometimes. I'm not really sure what for." David paused, uneasy, but he let it go. "I was here earlier today," he said, "and I think I left one of my father's sermon notebooks in the library. Also, I promised a sick child I'd bring him a take-home communion set. Would you be able to help with both?" The staffer nodded without hesitation. "Sure. We can check the library first." David followed him down the hallway. The smell of polished wood and old hymnals pulled him deeper into the church. When they stepped into the library, David immediately spotted the book still resting on the table, right where he'd left it. He exhaled softly and picked it up. The shelves had been neatened since earlier that day. Books were realigned. The search from hours before now just a memory, hidden beneath the illusion of order. David's eyes drifted upward. On the top shelf, one book sat crooked, jutting slightly over the edge. Something about it didn't sit right. He reached for it. "I can take care of that later," the staff member offered, stepping forward. But David was already pulling it down. It was heavier than he expected. The book hit the table with a muffled thud, pages spilling open. A plain title across the cover read Church Financial Management and Stewardship. He recognized it immediately, not the book itself, but the handwriting in the margins, his father's handwriting. He sat down slowly and turned the pages. Scripture references had been annotated, definitions of ethical stewardship underlined. Then, in the margins, notes in Isaiah Carter's handwriting, calm, firm, and precise. One sentence caught his eye. "This isn't just accounting, it's a covenant. God sees how we handle what's His." He flipped further. More notes. More markings. Then something stranger. Faint pencil traces, partially erased. Tilting the page to the light, David saw two names written carefully, then rubbed away. Brooks Green. A chill rippled through his chest. Beneath those faint marks, a sentence had been underlined 3 times. Accountability first to God, then to the congregation. If one misuses the sacred trust of the church and refuses repentance, he must be brought to light. David sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't conjecture. This was his father preparing for confrontation. A confrontation he never got to make. The staff member stepped back in with a cloth bag. "Here's the communion set, sir. Bread and juice, prepared this afternoon." David took it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." He glanced toward the window as he turned to leave. Out in the cemetery, two figures moved under the early dusk: Pastor Brooks and Reverend Green. They stood side by side, bent over a freshly disturbed patch of soil. One held a shovel, the other a bag. David frowned. "They're still out there?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Like I said, some sort of blessing. Sometimes they bless the graves of former members' pets, too, I think. I heard something about a dog today." David nodded slowly. "Thanks for your help." As he walked back to his car, communion in hand and the financial book under his arm, he felt the world tilt, not dramatically, but just enough to notice the imbalance. He slid into the driver's seat and looked again at the two men in the graveyard. Something about the scene. It wasn't right. The shovel, the bag, the hurried movement. He could feel it again, that pulse in his chest, that cold understanding that something sacred had been twisted, not just buried, but desecrated. He hadn't planned to stay, hadn't planned to confront. But something had changed. The communion he carried wasn't just for a child anymore. It was a symbol of everything his father believed in: sacrifice, redemption, truth. And David Carter was done running from all three. The drive back from Mount Olive was supposed to be simple: a short stop at the hospital, hand over the communion, check in on the boy, and go home. But nothing felt simple anymore. Not after what he had seen in the cemetery, not after what he had read. David's hands gripped the wheel tighter with every mile. The financial book lay on the passenger seat like a live wire, humming with implication. It wasn't just what his father had written. It was what had been erased. Brooks and Green, the underlined passages, the warnings, the way the names had been circled and rubbed out, like someone had tried to undo a truth they were terrified might surface again. But truth, David had learned, doesn't stay buried. Not forever. He pulled into the hospital parking lot as the sky dimmed to a rich indigo. Inside, the halls were quieter now, the evening shift giving way to the stillness of night. David walked softly, carrying the small communion set with reverence. The nurse at the front desk gave him a kind nod and waved him through. Noah's room was at the end of the hall. David knocked gently before stepping in. The boy was sitting upright now, pale but alert. His aunt and uncle sat nearby, worn out, guarded, their faces unreadable. "You came back," Noah said quietly. "I promised, didn't I?" David replied, smiling gently. The boy's aunt stood, unsure. "We're not very churchy," she said hesitantly. "Is this allowed without a pastor?" David looked at her, then back at the communion in his hands. "My father was a pastor," he said. "He taught me this ritual, and tonight I'm not doing it as a priest, just as a man keeping his word." She nodded, slowly, unsure but moved. David laid the small cloth bag on the rolling tray table. He unwrapped the elements carefully: small pieces of bread, individual cups of grape juice. As he did, he felt the weight of 100 Sunday mornings return to his fingertips. The smell, the silence, the meaning. "In my father's church," he began, "we believed communion was more than a symbol. It was a reminder that no matter how broken the world became, God still chose to dwell within it. And that when we remember Him, we remember that truth still matters. Noah watched him closely, eyes wide with quiet reverence. David distributed the bread, then the cups. The aunt hesitated, then accepted hers. The uncle followed. Together they bowed their heads. David spoke the words, not from a Bible, but from memory. This is his body, broken for you. This is his blood, shed for you. Do this in remembrance of him. They ate. They drank. The room was silent when it was over, but something had shifted. Not just in the air, but in David. Noah looked up at him with a faint smile. You sound like your dad. David blinked hard. I hope I do. He didn't stay much longer, just enough to say goodbye, to promise he'd check in again soon. Then he turned back toward the exit, heart heavier, but steadier. But something nagged at him. Back at the church, the top shelf, the erased names, the grave. Something was still wrong. David paused at the hospital's automatic doors, phone in hand. He scrolled through old contacts and found it. Mount Olive's landline. He pressed call. No answer. No voicemail. He tried again. Still nothing. A chill crept over him, even as the warm air brushed his skin. They're still at the cemetery, he thought. Without another word, he walked briskly to his car and turned the ignition. The headlights cut through the deepening dark. Gravel churned under his tires. When he arrived back at the church, the parking lot was nearly empty, except for one car. Reverend Green's. David parked far enough away to avoid notice and stepped out. He could see movement near the rear of the church grounds. He moved slowly, staying in the shadows. Beyond the fence, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, stood the two men, Pastor Brooks and Reverend Green, their bodies partially turned, voices hushed. Between them, a shovel gleamed, and a bag lay on the ground, long, lumpy, wrapped in black plastic. David's stomach turned. They hadn't finished whatever they started. He stepped forward, crunching a leaf beneath his boot. Both men looked up, startled. Evening, David said evenly. Brooks stepped back. David, what are you doing here? I forgot something, David replied. But now I see you were in the middle of something too. It's just an old grave, Green said quickly. A pet. We're making room. David's eyes moved to the bag. You dig up dog graves at night? Brooks cleared his throat. It's delicate. Families get emotional. David nodded, stepping closer. You know what I found today? A book. One with my father's handwriting. His notes. About money. About trust. About both of you. Green's hand twitched slightly. You knew, didn't you? David said, voice low. Back in '77, you knew he was going to expose someone, and you made sure his words never left the church. The wind stirred the leaves. Brooks swallowed. That's absurd. But Green looked pale. David stared at them both, heart hammering. He knew. He didn't have proof yet, not all of it. But he had seen enough, heard enough, felt it deep in his bones. I'll leave you to your blessing, David said coldly. But this isn't over. He turned and walked back to his car. Behind him, the men didn't speak, didn't move, but David could feel their eyes on his back. As he reached his vehicle, he slid into the seat and watched through the mirror. The two pastors still stood there, but something had shifted. The ease in their posture was gone. They were afraid, not of judgment, but of truth. David opened the financial book again. His father's notes stared back at him, quiet, steady, unflinching. And then something else caught his eye. A final margin note. Faint, almost erased. If they silence me, let the words survive. Let them speak where I cannot. David closed the book. He wasn't the only one left speaking. The moon was high and hard when David pulled out of the church parking lot, his headlights sweeping one last time across the still silhouettes of Reverend Green and Pastor Brooks. They hadn't moved since he'd confronted them, just stood there, like statues too proud to run, too guilty to speak. He didn't go home. He couldn't. Instead, he pulled his phone from the center console and did something he hadn't done since the forest. He called Detective Sarah Dawson. "Detective, it's David Carter." There was a pause. Then her voice, alert and even. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" "I'm not sure. I just left Mount Olive Church again. Green and Brooks. They were in the cemetery, digging. They said they were moving a pet's grave, but—" He looked back in his mirror. They had a bag, a large one. It didn't look like they were honoring anything. It looked like they were hiding something. Her voice sharpened. "Are you saying you witnessed suspicious activity?" "I'm saying I watched two men who've lied for 25 years standing over disturbed soil with a shovel and a bag at night." Another pause. "Where are they now?" "Still there, last I saw. But if I had to guess, they won't be for long." "Do not engage them again," she said firmly. "Keep your distance. I'm dispatching units now." David turned onto the county road, trying to calm his breathing. The communion set still sat beside him, now empty, but its meaning lingered in his chest like a bell still ringing. Ahead, at a traffic light on the edge of town, brake lights flashed. It was Green's car. David slowed. The light turned yellow, then red, but Green accelerated, flying through the intersection and turning down a narrow road leading east, away from homes, away from town, toward the wilderness. David didn't hesitate. He turned after him. His tires hummed against the old blacktop. The deeper he drove, the fewer streetlights appeared. This was logging country. No neighborhoods, no stores. Just forest and the soft glow of the moon slicing through the trees. His phone buzzed again. "Mr. Carter," Dawson said, "where are you?" "I'm on Mountain View Road. Green just passed the county line. He's headed into the hills." "I told you to wait." "I know," David answered, gripping the wheel tighter. "But if he's trying to dispose of something, I can't lose him. Stay on the line. Don't approach him. Officers are less than 10 minutes behind." "Understood." His headlights finally caught up to Green's car, a dark silhouette at the side of the road. The driver's door was open. No one inside. David pulled over, slowly, quietly. Ahead, a dirt path led to a scenic overlook called Eagle Point, a wooden platform perched on the cliffs, offering a view of the river below. He saw it then, a moving dot of light, Green's headlamp, and he was carrying the bag. David grabbed his flashlight, leaving the car door ajar. "He's on foot," he whispered into the phone, headed down the stairs to the lower platform. "Do not follow him," Dawson repeated. "Officers are en route." But David's feet were already moving. The wood steps creaked beneath his weight. Wind whistled through the pines. He followed the light down, heart thudding in his ears. The lower platform was a narrow deck overlooking the cliffs. Beyond that, nothing but air and the faint shimmer of the river hundreds of feet below. Green stood near the railing, the bag in one hand, shovel in the other. "Reverend," David called, his voice cutting through the dark. Green spun, startled. His eyes flared wide beneath the headlamp's beam. "You followed me?" David stepped forward, steady. "I had to." "You shouldn't be here," Green hissed. "I think I should. That bag you're holding, it doesn't hold forgiveness, does it?" Green's face twisted. "You don't understand." "Help me," David said, quieter now. "Please. Tell me what happened. Tell me the truth." The silence that followed wasn't long, but it felt ancient. "You know, don't you?" Green whispered. "You saw the notes. You read the book." David nodded. Green's grip on the bag loosened slightly. "We didn't mean to," he said hoarsely. "We didn't plan it. But your father, he said he'd tell everyone. He said he'd name names from the pulpit. We begged him to keep it quiet, to let us fix it, but he said we had until Sunday." "And you couldn't face the congregation," David said, voice shaking. "So you silenced him." Green's eyes welled. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. "But Brooks," he panicked. There was a struggle, and then he didn't finish. David stepped closer. "What's in the bag?" Green didn't answer. He just let it fall. It hit the wood with a deep thudding sound. Solid, heavy. David knelt and opened it. Inside, 2 books, wrapped in old cloth. The missing sermon notebook, the 1977 diary, and beneath them, a dust-covered plastic container. Inside it, bone fragments, ashes, a small cross. David stood, breathless. "You were going to throw him off the cliff," he said. "Bury the last piece of him. Erase the evidence." Police sirens rose in the distance. Green heard them too. He stepped back toward the railing. "No," David said quickly. "Don't do this. I can't face what comes next." "You don't have to face it alone. But you will face it, because you owe him that." The flashlight beam caught Green's face. Anguished, trembling. Suddenly, 2 officers appeared on the stairs, shouting commands. Green turned, panicked, but they lunged forward, grabbing his arms just as he tried to scale the railing. "You won't meet God that easily," one of them growled, pulling him down. David stood frozen, the bag still open at his feet. The sermon notebook's title page stared up at him through layers of dust. April 3rd, 1977. The courage to confront evil with love. Later, as police cars lined the overlook and crime scene lights bathed the trees in red and blue, David stood with Detective Dawson near her unmarked car. "You disobeyed direct instructions," she said, stern but soft. "I had to see it through." She looked at him, then at the evidence being carried into the back of a van. "Your father left a trail. You followed it." David nodded. "And now?" she asked. He looked out into the valley, wind tugging gently at his coat. "Now, we let the truth speak for itself." But deep down, he knew it would speak through him too. The police station buzzed with quiet urgency. Forensics officers moved with measured hands, cataloging every item recovered from the cliffside. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows over evidence tables. David sat at the far end of the room, still holding the sermon notebook like it might vanish if he blinked too long. Detective Sarah Dawson walked in with purpose, a clipboard tucked under one arm. She sat across from him, her tone softer than usual. The bone fragments will need DNA testing, but preliminary markers suggest they're human, and likely male. Given everything we found, the odds are very high that these are your father's remains. David didn't speak at first. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the table. 25 years of silence. And now, a handful of ash, bone, and ink had become a voice loud enough to shake the walls. We also retrieved both the 1977 sermon notebook and his personal diary, Dawson continued. The diary is severely water damaged, possibly from being buried in a shallow grave first, but our team managed to isolate several legible sections. She handed him a plastic sleeve with a single page inside. The ink was faded, but the words still burned. They continue to deny it. But the numbers do not lie. The church's sacred funds are being siphoned. I've prayed for a path to resolution. I've begged for repentance, but now, I believe I must speak this Sunday, even if it costs me everything. David closed his eyes. He could almost hear his father's voice again, not just preaching, but pleading. A man trying to save both souls and the sanctity of a place he had loved too deeply. The sermons are in much better shape, Dawson said. The final entry before he vanished? A lesson titled The Courage to Confront Evil with Love. David exhaled sharply. He remembered that phrase. It had been scrawled on the last sticky note Isaiah had pinned to the family fridge. At 15, David had thought it sounded like something out of a superhero movie. Now, he understood it for what it truly was, a man's last testament, written in hope and desperation. There was a knock at the door. A uniformed officer stepped in with an update. Reverend Green has been transferred to holding. He confessed fully, confirmed everything, says he's ready to testify. As for Pastor Brooks, he was arrested at the church 10 minutes ago, tried to deny involvement, but when we told him about Green's confession, he broke. David leaned back in his chair. So that's it then. It's the beginning, Dawson corrected. There'll be a full investigation into the church's financial records. The congregation will need answers. But for your father, yes, it's justice. David looked down at his hands. The skin was trembling. Not from fear, but from release. For the first time in a quarter century, he wasn't carrying the weight alone. Can I take these with me? He asked, motioning to the sermon book and diary pages. You can make copies, Dawson said, but the originals stay in evidence until the trial. David nodded. Copies are fine. I'm not taking them to hide. I'm taking them to read, to finish what he started. Later that night, long after the evidence bags had been sealed and the fluorescent lights dimmed, David stood beneath a black velvet sky in the cemetery behind Mount Olive. The stars were cold and clear overhead. In his hands was a new container, a polished cedar box holding what remained of Isaiah Carter. No longer beneath a tree stump. No longer hidden in a grave dug for a dog. Now, laid to rest beside Sarah Carter, his wife, David's mother. A small crowd had gathered. Former congregants, hospital nurses. Even Noah's aunt and uncle stood in the back, heads bowed. Noah clutched a single white lily. David stepped forward. No suit, no Bible, just the sermon book. I thought I came here to bury a past, he said, voice steady. But instead, I found a legacy. My father was not perfect, But he was faithful, and he died trying to protect the very place that turned against him. Tonight, we return him to where he belongs, with truth, with dignity, and with peace. He opened the notebook and read, "When evil rises inside the house of God, it is not silence that honors him, but the courage to speak, not in hatred, but in love. For love does not hide the light. It walks toward it." As he closed the book, the wind rustled the leaves gently, like an amen whispered through time. The cedar box was lowered into the earth. No brass bands, no trumpet calls, just a sun, a community, and a truth that refused to stay buried. 3 days later, David returned to the hospital. Noah's room was brighter now, curtains open, sunlight filtering in. The boy's fever had broken, and his cheeks were fuller. "You came back," Noah said, smiling. "Told you I would." The boy's aunt looked up from her chair. "We've been talking. We might bring him to church. Maybe not the old way, but something." David nodded. Mount Olive might be looking for new leadership. "You?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "No," David said, "but I'll help them heal. The truth's out now. Maybe they'll be ready to build something honest." Noah reached out, tugging gently at David's sleeve. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he whispered. David knelt beside him. "Then start by being brave. Brave enough to ask questions. Brave enough to care. And brave enough to love. Especially when it's hardest." Outside, the church bells rang in the distance. Faint, but steady. Later that evening, back in his apartment, David sat in the same chair he had the morning that call came in. But everything felt different now. On the table lay copies of his father's words. Truth preserved through time, pain, and silence. He opened the final sermon again and read the last line aloud. "What the darkness buries, love will one day raise." David Carter closed the book, looked up through the window at the stars, and whispered to no one and to everything, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you." He didn't expect a reply, but deep in his chest, where silence used to live, something stirred. And this time, it felt a lot like peace.